When a mysterious box is unearthed during garden renovations at Gossington Hall, only one woman can unravel the decades-old riddle it contains. Welcome to Cafe Stories. I am your host, Alfie. Your continued support makes these stories possible, and I'm thankful for each of you. Let me know in the comments which corner of the world you're listening from today. Grab something warm to drink, find a comfortable seat, and let's join Miss Marple in the charming village of St. Mary Mead as she uncovers secrets buried in time. Miss Marple and the Rose Garden Riddle. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Discovery. It was on a particularly fine Tuesday morning in early May that the gardeners at Gossington Hall made their curious discovery. Colonel Bantry had been planning the new rose garden for months, ever since his wife had returned from a visit to Lady Carrington's estate with a head full of ideas about heritage roses and their superior fragrances. "You simply must replant the northeast corner, Arthur," Mrs. Dolly Bantry had insisted over breakfast one morning. "It gets the most marvellous light, and we could have the most wonderful display. Lady Carrington says her Bourbon roses are the envy of the county." Colonel Bantry, who preferred his garden to remain exactly as it had been for the past 30 years, had put up only token resistance. He knew from long experience that when Dolly set her mind on a new project, it was easier to acquiesce gracefully than to wage a futile battle against the inevitable. And so it was that on this particular morning, Simmons, the head gardener, and his 2 assistants were turning over the soil in what had previously been a rather unremarkable corner of lawn bordered by an ancient yew hedge. The colonel was supervising the work with a critical eye, his hands clasped behind his back, occasionally offering unnecessary advice, which Simmons acknowledged with a patient, "Yes, sir." The ground was being thoroughly prepared for the new rose beds. Colonel Bantry had consulted several gardening books and had drawn up a meticulous plan showing where each variety was to be planted to create the most pleasing arrangement of colours and scents. "Careful with that root, Jenkins," the colonel called out to the younger gardener. "Don't want to—" His instructions were cut short by a sharp, metallic clang as Jenkins's spade struck something solid. "What's that you've hit?" Colonel Bantry asked, moving forward with sudden interest. "Don't rightly know, sir," Jenkins replied, bending down to investigate. "Something metal by the sound of it." The 3 gardeners and the colonel gathered around as Jenkins carefully cleared away the soil to reveal a small metal box, roughly the size of a cigar case, but squarer in shape. It was tarnished with age and encrusted with dirt, but appeared to be intact. "Well, well," said Colonel Bantry, his interest thoroughly piqued. "What have we here?" "Buried treasure, sir," suggested the youngest gardener with a grin. "More likely to be someone's lost trinket," Simmons said dismissively, "or perhaps a child's hiding place." Colonel Bantry picked up the box, which was heavier than its size suggested. "Let's take it up to the house," he decided. "Mrs. Bantry will be interested to see it." Mrs. Bantry was indeed most interested. She was in the morning room arranging flowers when her husband entered, still wearing his gardening boots, much to the silent disapproval of Lorimer, the butler. "Look what Jenkins dug up in the northeast corner," Colonel Bantry announced, placing the soil-encrusted box on a side table. "Arthur, not on the marquetry!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, hastily moving her flower arrangement to make room for a newspaper upon which the colonel could place his find. Once the precious table was protected, Mrs. Bantry's curiosity overcame her concern for the furniture. "What is it? Can it be opened?" The box had no obvious lock, but the lid seemed firmly stuck. After some careful manipulation by Colonel Bantry, accompanied by suggestions from his wife that he might break it if he used too much force, the lid finally came loose with a reluctant creak. Inside, nestled on what had once been velvet but was now a disintegrated, dusty material, lay 2 items, a folded piece of yellowed paper and a tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. How perfectly intriguing, Mrs. Bantry said, reaching for the locket. It was oval in shape, with an intricate pattern engraved on its surface. She pressed the tiny catch, and it opened to reveal a miniature portrait of a young woman with a serious expression, dressed in the fashion of perhaps 50 or 60 years ago. "Pretty girl," remarked Colonel Bantry. "Wonder who she was." While his wife examined the locket, the colonel carefully unfolded the piece of paper. The writing on it was faded, but still legible, written in an elegant flowing hand. "Where ancient guardians cast their shade upon the 7th hour, count 12 paces north from where the waters meet the stone. What lies beneath the constant star will guide the rightful heir." "It's a riddle," said Mrs. Bantry, looking over her husband's shoulder at the paper. "How exciting!" Colonel Bantry harumphed. "Probably some children playing at pirates or treasure hunts. The box has likely been there for decades." "But it might be important," Mrs. Bantry protested. "The rightful heir, it says. That sounds quite significant." "Nonsense, my dear," the colonel said firmly. "Just a game, I'm sure of it." Mrs. Bantry was not so easily convinced. "I think we should ask Jane what she makes of it." "Jane? Jane who?" "Jane Marple, of course. She has such a good head for puzzles, and besides, I was going to ask her advice about the roses anyway. She knows everything there is to know about the old varieties." Colonel Bantry sighed. "If you wish, my dear, though I can't see what Miss Marple will make of an old children's game." Miss Jane Marple arrived at Gossington Hall the following afternoon, having received an enthusiastic, if somewhat incoherent, telephone call from Mrs. Bantry about roses and buried treasures. She was a tall, thin woman with snow-white hair and a gentle, deceptively vague expression. She wore a tweed coat despite the mild weather and carried a capacious handbag of well-worn leather. Mrs. Bantry greeted her effusively and immediately led her to the morning room, where the metal box and its contents were displayed on the table. "Isn't it all perfectly mysterious, Jane? Arthur thinks it's nothing but children playing games, but I'm sure there's more to it. The portrait in the locket is quite striking, don't you think? I wonder who she was." Miss Marple examined the items with careful attention, particularly the riddle. "How very interesting," she murmured. "And you say it was found in the northeast corner of the garden?" "Yes, where we're putting in the new rose garden. That's the other thing I wanted to ask you about. You must come and advise us on the varieties. Arthur has made a plan, but you know how men are with these things." "I should be delighted to help," Miss Marple said, replacing the locket in the box. "I'm particularly fond of the old Bourbon and Gallica roses. They have such superior scent to the modern hybrids." As they walked out to see the proposed site for the rose garden, Miss Marple listened patiently to Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic plans, but her mind was working on the curious find, and her eyes took in every detail of the location where the box had been unearthed. The news of the discovery spread quickly through the village of St. Mary Mead, as such news invariably does. By evening, at least 5 different versions of what had been found were circulating, ranging from a child's toy to ancient Roman artifacts. Miss Marple, walking home along the village street, overheard Mrs. Blade at the greengrocer's speaking in hushed tones about buried treasure and secret maps. She smiled to herself. Villages were very much the same the world over, she thought. A small mystery, a hint of the unknown, and imaginations ran wild. Yet experience had taught her that the truth was often more interesting than fiction, and sometimes more dangerous. The roses at Gossington Hall would need careful selection and placement. But Miss Marple had a feeling that this little mystery might require even more careful attention than the Colonel's garden plans. Chapter 2. The London Solicitor. 3 days after the curious discovery at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple was in her garden, carefully deadheading the early spring blooms. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of her beloved narcissi, which formed a cheerful border along the garden path. "Cherry Baker," called Miss Marple to her young help, who came 3 mornings a week, "would you be so kind as to bring me the small secateurs? These stems are rather tough for my old fingers." As Cherry hurried to fetch the requested tool, Miss Marple's attention was caught by an unfamiliar figure walking past her garden gate. A tall, spare man of perhaps 50, with a distinctly urban appearance, despite his tweed suit, which seemed too new and too fashionable for country wear. He carried a slim leather briefcase and consulted a small notebook before turning in at the vicarage gate. "A visitor for the vicar," Miss Marple murmured to herself. St. Mary Mead might be a small village, but Miss Marple had long ago perfected the art of noting everything without appearing to do so. Later that morning, Miss Marple's telephone rang, a sound which, despite having been installed for several years now, still startled her somewhat. "Jane? It's Dolly Bantry. Are you engaged for tea this afternoon?" "No, I don't believe I have any plans," replied Miss Marple. "Then you must come over. Colonel Bantry is being absolutely impossible about the rose garden plans, and I need your support." And Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially, though there was no one to overhear her. "The most interesting man has arrived in the village, a solicitor from London staying at the Blue Boar. He's been asking questions about Gossington Hall." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "How very interesting. He's coming for tea at 4. I've invited the vicar and his wife too to make it a proper party. Do say you'll come, Jane." "I should be delighted," Miss Marple replied, her curiosity thoroughly piqued. At precisely 3:30, Miss Marple set out for Gossington Hall. She wore her second-best grey silk dress and carried a folder of rose catalogues she had collected for Mrs. Bantry's benefit. The walk was pleasant, and she paused several times to admire the spring flowers in various gardens along the way, exchanging greetings with their proud owners. She arrived at Gossington Hall to find Mrs. Bantry in a state of suppressed excitement. "Jane, I'm so glad you've come early. I wanted to tell you before the others arrive. This solicitor, Mr. Carmichael is his name, has been making the most particular inquiries about the previous owners of Gossington Hall, the Tressilians, you know, who sold the place to Arthur's father. It seems there might be some legal matter involving the property." "How very unusual," remarked Miss Marple, settling herself in a comfortable chair. "The Tressilians left the district quite 50 years ago, did they not?" "Yes, after old Mr. Tressilian died and his nephew inherited. They were quite an old family, but I believe there was some financial difficulty. Arthur's father bought the property at a rather advantageous price, or so he always said." The sound of wheels on gravel announced the arrival of the first guests. Through the drawing-room window, Miss Marple observed the vicar and his wife being helped out of an ancient Morris by the stranger she had seen that morning. Presumably Mr. Carmichael, the London solicitor. The introductions were made with the usual formality. Mr. Carmichael had the polished manners of a city professional, but there was a certain keenness in his gaze that Miss Marple did not fail to notice. "Miss Marple is our local expert on roses," Mrs. Bantry explained. "She's advising us on the new garden." "How delightful," said Mr. Carmichael, with a courteous nod. "A most genteel hobby." "Oh, I wouldn't claim any expertise," said Miss Marple, modestly. "Merely the accumulated experience of many years of trial and error." The conversation flowed pleasantly around general topics: the unusual fineness of the spring weather, the difficulties of travel from London, the charm of the countryside. Colonel Bantry, somewhat stiff at first with the city solicitor, gradually warmed up when the conversation turned to fishing, a passion they apparently shared. It was not until tea was well underway, with Lorimer serving Mrs. Bantry's best Earl Grey in the second-best china, the best being reserved for more formal occasions, that Mr. Carmichael introduced the topic that had apparently brought him to St. Mary Mead. "I understand, Colonel, that your family acquired Gossington Hall from the Tresillian estate." "My father did, yes," replied the Colonel. "Must have been, let me see, 1897 or thereabouts." "And the transaction included all the original grounds. There were no parcels of land excluded or sold separately." Colonel Bantry looked somewhat puzzled. "Not to my knowledge. The estate was sold intact. Why do you ask?" Mr. Carmichael smiled apologetically. "A matter for one of my clients, a descendant of the Tresillian family. There is some question about a small parcel of land that may have been subject to a separate trust. A formality, really, after all this time, but the law must be satisfied." "How interesting," Mrs. Bantry interjected. "And speaking of discoveries, did Arthur tell you about what our gardeners found while preparing the ground for our new rose garden?" Colonel Bantry frowned slightly at his wife, but Mrs. Bantry was too excited to notice. "A small metal box," she continued, "with the most intriguing contents, a locket with a portrait, and a mysterious riddle. We found it in the northeast corner of the grounds." At the mention of the northeast corner, Miss Marple noticed a subtle change in Mr. Carmichael's expression, a momentary sharpening of interest, quickly masked by polite curiosity. "How fascinating," he said. "An old property like Gossington Hall must have many stories to tell. Might I, that is, would it be an imposition to see this discovery?" "Not at all," Mrs. Bantry said enthusiastically. "I'll fetch it directly." While Mrs. Bantry was out of the room, Mr. Carmichael turned to Miss Marple. "You've lived in the village a long time, I understand, Miss Marple." "All my life," she replied with a gentle smile. "A rather uneventful existence, I'm afraid." "Then you might possibly remember the Tresillian family. My client is particularly interested in any local stories or traditions associated with them." Before Miss Marple could respond, Mrs. Bantry returned with the metal box. Mr. Carmichael examined the box and its contents with what seemed to Miss Marple to be carefully modulated interest, neither too keen nor too dismissive. "Charming," he said, studying the locket. "Definitely mid-Victorian by the style, and this riddle, most intriguing." "We thought it might be a child's game," said Colonel Bantry. "Buried and forgotten." "Perhaps," Mr. Carmichael agreed, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Colonel, I wonder if I might impose upon you for a tour of the grounds tomorrow, particularly the area where this was found. It might help clarify some points for my client's inquiries." "I suppose so," the Colonel agreed, somewhat reluctantly, "though I don't see what bearing it could have on any legal matters after all this time." After tea, Mr. Carmichael took his leave, thanking Mrs. Bantry for her hospitality. As she saw their guests out, Miss Marple wandered to the window that overlooked the garden. From there, she could see the newly turned earth where the rose garden would be planted. She noticed Mr. Carmichael pause on the drive, his gaze fixed on that very spot with an intensity that seemed at odds with his casual manner during tea. That evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the solicitor's particular interest in the northeast corner of the Gossington Hall grounds. It reminded her, in a way, of young Tommy Fletcher's behaviour when he had hidden his grandfather's watch in the church graveyard, the studied casualness that conceals urgent interest. She picked up her knitting, a pink baby shawl for her grandniece's expected arrival, and as her needles clicked rhythmically, her mind sorted through the afternoon's events. Mr. Carmichael had asked specifically about land parcels and trusts, and his reaction to the location of the box's discovery, that momentary flash of intensity, suggested knowledge he wasn't sharing. Miss Marple remembered something her father, a solicitor himself, had once said. "When a lawyer comes asking old questions, Jane, depend upon it, there's new money at stake." She set aside her knitting and turned out the light. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to old Miss Weatherby. At 87 she was the oldest resident of St. Mary Mead, and had been a frequent visitor to Gossington Hall in the Tressilians' time. If there were stories to be told about the old family, Miss Weatherby would know them. And Miss Marple had a feeling that there was considerably more to Mr. Carmichael's interest than a simple matter of property records. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Past. Miss Marple set out early the following morning to visit Miss Weatherby. The day promised fair weather with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring blossoms through the village. She paused briefly at the vicarage garden where the vicar's wife was dead-heading early tulips. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Clement cheerfully. "Off to visit Miss Weatherby, are you?" "Yes, indeed," replied Miss Marple. "I thought she might enjoy some of my black currant preserve, and I confess I'm curious about her memories of the Tressilian family." Mrs. Clement nodded knowingly. "Because of that London solicitor, he called on the vicar yesterday asking all manner of questions about old parish records." "Did he indeed?" Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "And what did the vicar tell him?" "That most of the older records were transferred to the county archives years ago, but Mr. Carmichael seemed particularly interested in the plot plans for the churchyard and surrounding lands. Most peculiar." Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed peculiar, and continued on her way, her mind busily connecting these new fragments of information. Miss Weatherby lived in a small but perfectly maintained cottage at the far end of the village. Despite her advanced years, she maintained a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. She received Miss Marple in her sitting room, which was crowded with furniture and mementos from a long life. "Jane Marple," she said, with satisfaction, adjusting her ear trumpet. "Come to ask about the Tressilians, I suppose. News travels fast in St. Mary Mead." "You always did have a gift for divination, Emily," Miss Marple said with a smile, taking the seat offered to her. "Nothing of the sort. Simple observation. That London solicitor has been asking questions all over the village, and now you appear with black currant jam, which you know I'm particularly fond of. Naturally you want information." Miss Marple laughed softly. "You're quite right, of course. I was hoping you might remember something about the Tressilians, particularly concerning Gossington Hall." Miss Weatherby's rheumy eyes took on a faraway look. "I was a girl when old Mr. Tressilian died. Must have been the winter of 94 or 95. There was quite the commotion about the inheritance. His son had died in India the year before, you see. The property went to his nephew, Frederick Tressilian, a most unpleasant young man who had lived in London and rarely visited." "Was there any dispute about the inheritance?" Miss Marple inquired, pouring tea from the pot that Miss Weatherby's aged maid had brought in. "Oh, indeed there was," Miss Weatherby said, with relish. The old man's granddaughter, his son's child, had been raised at Gossington Hall since her parents' death. Everyone expected her to inherit, or at least to be provided for. But the will left everything to Frederick. There was talk in the village that the will had been altered. "And what happened to the granddaughter?" Miss Marple asked. "Catherine Tressilian," Miss Weatherby said, nodding. "A lovely girl with chestnut hair. She left shortly after the estate was sold, went to live with a distant cousin in Northumberland, I believe. There were rumours that she had contested the will, but lacked the resources to pursue the matter in court." Miss Marple carefully extracted a miniature photograph from her handbag. It was a copy of the portrait in the locket, which she had asked Mrs. Bantry's permission to have photographed by the chemist's assistant. Might this be Catherine Tressilian? Miss Weatherby adjusted her spectacles and peered at the image. "Why, yes." "Where did you get this?" Miss Marple explained about the box found at Gossington Hall, watching Miss Weatherby's reaction closely. "A riddle, you say? How extraordinary! And in the northeast corner of the garden?" Miss Weatherby's eyes gleamed with excitement. That's where the old sundial used to stand, you know. It was quite famous in its day, a beautiful piece with an unusual design. The pedestal was carved with stars and celestial symbols. Catherine's mother brought it with her when she married into the family. It disappeared after the estate was sold. This was valuable information indeed. Miss Marple tucked it away for future consideration. After leaving Miss Wetherby, Miss Marple made 2 more calls that morning. First to elderly Mrs. Darnley, who had once been housekeeper at Gossington Hall under the Tressilians, and then to Mr. Griffiths, the retired schoolmaster, who had a passion for local history. Each conversation yielded small but potentially significant details. Mrs. Darnley remembered that old Mr. Tressilian had kept a locked room on the ground floor, where he often worked late into the night, and which his nephew Frederick had immediately emptied upon taking possession. Mr. Griffiths recalled that the boundary of the Gossington Hall estate had once extended further to the east, encompassing what was now the village common, but that a portion had been sold off separately during some financial difficulty in the 1880s. As Miss Marple walked home, she observed Mr. Carmichael emerging from the county records office, a leather portfolio under his arm. He was deep in conversation with Colonel Bantry, who appeared to be showing him a map or document. They were too engrossed to notice Miss Marple, who slowed her pace to observe them more carefully. The Colonel was pointing at something on the paper, his expression puzzled. Mr. Carmichael nodded and made a note in a small book he carried. Then they walked together in the direction of Gossington Hall, still conversing intently. Miss Marple decided that a visit to Mrs. Bantry was in order. She would suggest that the Bourbon roses would look particularly fine against the yew hedge in the new garden, which would give her a perfect excuse to visit Gossington Hall that afternoon. When she arrived, she found Mrs. Bantry in a state of nervous excitement. "Jane, how providential that you've come! The most extraordinary thing has happened. A young woman has arrived at the Blue Boar claiming to be Mr. Carmichael's assistant. She called here not an hour ago asking to see the exact spot where the box was found." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple. "And did you show her?" "Arthur did. He and Mr. Carmichael have been poring over old boundary maps all morning. It seems there is some question about the property lines. The young woman, Miss Fellows she calls herself, took the most particular interest in the northeast corner. She even asked if we had noticed any unusual stonework or markings when the gardeners were digging." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And where are Colonel Bantry and Mr. Carmichael now?" "They've gone to meet with Mr. Peterson at the land registry. Something about an annotation on the original deed that needs clarification. It's all becoming rather involved." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward confidentially. "Jane, do you think this has something to do with the riddle in the box? Where ancient guardians cast their shade upon the 7th hour, count 12 paces north from where the waters meet the stone. Could it be some sort of treasure map?" "It does sound rather like directions to a specific spot," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. "Miss Wetherby mentioned an ornamental sundial that once stood in that corner of the garden." "A sundial!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "Of course, the 7th hour, that would be where the shadow falls at 7 o'clock, and ancient guardians could refer to the old yew trees that have been there for centuries." "It's a possibility," Miss Marple conceded. "And where the waters meet the stone might indicate a fountain or a drainage channel." "We must investigate," Mrs. Bantry declared with enthusiasm. "Arthur will be occupied with Mr. Carmichael all afternoon. We could examine the garden ourselves." Miss Marple agreed, and the 2 ladies spent a concentrated hour inspecting the northeast corner of the garden. The area had been thoroughly disturbed by the gardeners preparing for the new rose beds, but along the edge of the yew hedge they discovered something of interest, a partially buried stone with unusual markings that might once have been part of a larger structure. "Could this be part of the sundial pedestal?" Mrs. Bantry wondered, brushing soil from the carved surface. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "The symbol appears to be a star. Miss Weatherby mentioned celestial symbols." Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Fellows, who approached with an air of forced casualness. "Oh, Mrs. Bantry, I was hoping to find Mr. Carmichael here." Miss Fellows was a slim, dark-haired woman of about 30, smartly dressed but with a certain tension in her manner that Miss Marple immediately noticed. Her eyes kept darting to the area where they had been examining the stone. "He's at the land registry with my husband," Mrs. Bantry explained. "May I present my friend, Miss Marple?" "We were just discussing the best placement for some climbing roses." "How do you do?" said Miss Fellows with a brief nod. "I won't disturb your gardening plans. I'll try to catch Mr. Carmichael later." She departed with one last glance at the garden corner, walking a little too quickly for someone merely delivering a routine message. "A rather intense young woman," remarked Miss Marple after Miss Fellows had gone, "and extraordinarily interested in this particular corner of your garden." As they walked back to the house, Miss Marple found herself recalling another case of suspicious interest, the affair of Mrs. Pritchard's ruby brooch and the too attentive parlour-maid. Sometimes the most revealing clue was not what people said, but what they couldn't keep themselves from looking at. That evening, in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple added these new observations to her mental catalogue. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern. The disputed inheritance, the missing sundial, the specific interest in the northeast corner. But what was the connection to the present day nearly 50 years later? And what did Mr. Carmichael and his assistant hope to find? She remembered the last line of the riddle. "What lies beneath the constant star will guide the rightful heir." The constant star, the North Star perhaps, or a star design on the sundial. And who might be the rightful heir after all this time? Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the rhythmic movement of her needles helping to order her thoughts. Tomorrow, she decided, she would examine the parish registers. If Catherine Tressilian had indeed had descendants, their names might be recorded there. And then there was the matter of that unusual stone by the yew hedge. She would need to take a closer look at those markings. The rose garden at Gossington Hall was proving to be far more interesting than even Mrs. Bantry had anticipated. Chapter 4. A Death Among the Roses. Miss Marple was an early riser by habit. The quiet morning hours provided the perfect opportunity for gardening without interruption, and on this particular morning she had decided to examine more closely some rose varieties in her own garden that might be suitable for the Bantry's new planting scheme. The sun had barely risen, the dew still heavy on the grass, when she heard a sharp rapping at her garden gate. It was most unusual to have visitors at such an hour. She looked up to see young Fred Jackson, the under-gardener from Gossington Hall, his face pale with distress. "Miss Marple, ma'am," he called out, "Mrs. Bantry sent me to fetch you. There's been a dreadful thing at the Hall." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, removing her gardening gloves. "What has happened?" "It's that London gentleman, Mr. Carmichael. He's been found in the rose garden, ma'am. Dead he is. Dr. Haydock's been called, but Mrs. Bantry asked for you particularly." Miss Marple wasted no time. She changed her gardening apron for a respectable coat, collected her handbag, and accompanied the young gardener back to Gossington Hall. They found the household in disarray. Colonel Bantry was standing grimly by the telephone in the hall, having just concluded a call. Mrs. Bantry, unusually subdued, was sitting in the morning room with a cup of untouched tea before her. "Jane, thank goodness!" she exclaimed when Miss Marple entered. "The most awful thing has happened. Mr. Carmichael has been found dead in the garden. Simmons discovered him when he went out early to continue the preparations for the rose beds." "How very distressing," said Miss Marple, taking a seat beside her friend. "What does Dr. Haydock say?" "He thinks it was a heart attack," Colonel Bantry said, entering the room. Apparently the man was out there in the early hours, heaven knows why, dressed in his city clothes too, must have had some sort of seizure while examining the garden. "The northeast corner again," Mrs. Bantry added significantly. "Right where we found that carved stone yesterday?" Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "And what time was he found?" "Just after 6, Colonel Bantry replied. "Simmons starts early this time of year. Poor fellow was quite upset." "I imagine the police have been notified?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Inspector Slack is on his way," confirmed the Colonel with a slight grimace. The inspector's methods had brought him into conflict with Colonel Bantry on previous occasions, though it seems straightforward enough, natural causes. "Has anyone informed Miss Fellows?" Miss Marple asked. "She is, after all, his assistant." "That's just it." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "We telephoned the Blue Boar, but they say she went out last evening and hasn't returned. Her things are still in her room, but she's not been seen since dinner." This was an interesting development indeed. Miss Marple filed it away in her methodical mind as Dr. Haydock entered the room, his medical bag in hand, his expression grave. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a nod of recognition, "I might have known you would be here." "Jane is helping us with the rose garden," Mrs. Bantry explained quickly. "What can you tell us, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock looked thoughtful. "At first glance, it appears to be a heart attack. The man was in his 50s, overweight, likely under stress." "However," he hesitated. "Yes, Doctor," Miss Marple prompted gently. "There are one or two aspects that trouble me. The position of the body, for one, and there appears to be some soil disturbance that doesn't align with a man simply collapsing. I've asked that nothing be moved until Inspector Slack arrives." "Where exactly was he found?" Miss Marple inquired. "In the northeast corner," Dr. Haydock replied. "By the old yew hedge. Curious spot to be examining in the half-light of dawn, I would have thought." Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed curious, and after Dr. Haydock departed to await the inspector's arrival, she asked the Colonel if she might see where the body had been discovered. "I suppose there's no harm in it," he said reluctantly. "Though mind you don't touch anything, Miss Marple. Slack will have my head if the scene is disturbed." Miss Marple assured him that she would be most careful, and together they walked out to the garden. The morning was now fully established, with sunlight streaming across the lawns of Gossington Hall. In the northeast corner, a dark shape lay covered with a gardener's tarpaulin. Simmons, the gardener, stood a respectful distance away, as if keeping guard. "Right there he was," Simmons said, pointing, "face down in the soil where we'd been preparing for the new roses. Most peculiar, if you ask me. What would bring a gentleman out at that hour, and in his good shoes too?" "Indeed?" murmured Miss Marple, surveying the scene with careful attention. She noticed several things that interested her. The soil around where the body lay had been disturbed, but not in the manner one would expect from a man collapsing suddenly. There were signs of something having been moved, a rectangular impression in the soil near the hedge. And most curiously, there were footprints, small, narrow footprints that were certainly not made by Mr. Carmichael's substantial Oxford shoes nor by Simmons's work boots. She was about to comment on these observations when the sound of a motor car announced the arrival of Inspector Slack. His quick, efficient stride brought him swiftly to the scene, his notebook already in hand. "Colonel, Mrs. Bantry," he acknowledged, with a brisk nod. Then, spotting Miss Marple, he added, with barely concealed impatience, "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. This is a police matter now, if you please." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I was merely advising on the rose planting." Inspector Slack raised a sceptical eyebrow, but turned his attention to Dr. Haydock, who had joined them. The two men conversed in low tones while examining the covered body. Mrs. Bantry drew Miss Marple aside. "Jane, what do you make of it? Could it really be just a heart attack? It seems so strange that he would be out here at dawn." "It is certainly unusual," agreed Miss Marple. "And I noticed something that the inspector will no doubt discover for himself. There are footprints that appear to be a woman's." "Miss Fellows?" Mrs. Bantry whispered. "But she's missing." "Indeed," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Most interesting." They were interrupted by Inspector Slack, who had begun issuing orders to his constables. The body was photographed, then carefully removed to be taken to the morgue. Slack questioned Colonel Bantry, then Simmons, meticulously noting their statements. When he came to Miss Marple, his manner was less than enthusiastic. "I suppose you've made some observations that you feel might be helpful, Miss Marple?" "I wouldn't presume to instruct the police, Inspector," she replied with disarming modesty, "though I did happen to notice those footprints by the hedge, a woman's, I believe." Slack's eyes narrowed. "Yes, we've noted those, as well as signs that something was recently dug up and removed from this area. Colonel Bantry informs me that Mr. Carmichael was investigating an old property matter." "Did he discuss this with you?" Miss Marple explained about the metal box and its contents, the riddle, and Mr. Carmichael's interest in the northeast corner. Inspector Slack listened with growing interest. "And this box is where now?" he demanded. "In my study," said Colonel Bantry. "I'd be happy to show you." As they walked back to the house, Inspector Slack drew Miss Marple slightly aside. "The doctor has concerns," he said in a low voice. "There are indications that this may not have been a natural death. The position of the body, certain marks on the neck. We'll know more after the post-mortem." Inside, Colonel Bantry produced the metal box and its contents for inspection. Inspector Slack examined the riddle with particular attention. "What lies beneath the constant star will guide the rightful heir," he read aloud. "Sounds like directions to something valuable. And this man Carmichael was a solicitor investigating a property matter from the previous century. Most convenient that he should suffer a heart attack just at that spot." The riddle quickly became the center of attention. Various interpretations were suggested as to its meaning. Mrs. Bantry was particularly taken with the idea that it might lead to hidden jewels from the Tresillian estate. It would explain why Mr. Carmichael was so interested in that specific corner of the garden, she pointed out, and if Miss Fellows knew about it too. "We'll need to find this Miss Fellows," Slack said firmly. "She may have vital information if she's not involved herself." As the morning progressed, the investigation gained momentum. Constables were dispatched to search for Miss Fellows. A telegraph was sent to Mr. Carmichael's law offices in London. Inspector Slack ordered a thorough search of the northeast corner of the garden, looking for any further clues to what Carmichael might have been seeking. Miss Marple, observing it all, found her thoughts returning to a similar case from many years before. The unexpected arrival of a stranger asking questions about the past, followed by a sudden death. There had been the bank manager, Mr. Hollingsworth, who had come to St. Mary Mead ostensibly on holiday, but who had spent his time making inquiries about old families and property lines. His sudden departure after receiving a mysterious message had been the talk of the village for weeks. She would need to consult her gardening journals, where she often noted village events alongside her horticultural observations. If there was a pattern to be discerned, it might help to understand the present mystery. As she took her leave of the Bantrys, promising to return the following day to continue their discussions about the rose garden, Miss Marple's mind was working busily on the problem presented by Mr. Carmichael's untimely death and the curious riddle that seemed to have led him to his fate. The rose garden at Gossington Hall was proving to be far more deadly than anyone could have anticipated. Chapter 5. Parallel patterns. The afternoon following Mr. Carmichael's death was unseasonably warm, the kind of spring day that hints at summer. Miss Marple sat in her garden room with several well-worn notebooks spread before her on the small writing desk. These were her gardening journals, meticulously kept over decades, recording not only the progress of her beloved plants, but also the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead. "Now then," she murmured to herself, adjusting her spectacles, "it would have been 1927 or perhaps early 1928. Her slender fingers carefully turned the pages of a notebook bound in faded green cloth. She paused at an entry from February 1928. "Ah, yes, here it is. Planted new Albertine rose cutting, weather unseasonably mild. Mr. Hollingsworth, bank manager from London, asking questions about old Tresillian property. Very interested in boundary markers and original estate layout." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. The entry continued on the next page, dated 2 weeks later. "Albertine showing good root growth. Mr. Hollingsworth departed suddenly after receiving telegram. Much speculation in village. Mrs. Barker at post office suggests family emergency." She consulted another journal, this one from late spring of the same year. Nellie Jenkins mentioned that her grandfather, former gardener at Gossington, spoke of Mr. Hollingsworth's interest in the old sundial that once stood in the northeast corner. Said the bank manager offered £5 to show him exact location, a substantial sum that made grandfather suspicious. These entries confirmed what Miss Marple had begun to suspect, that Mr. Carmichael was not the first person to take an interest in that particular corner of the Gossington Hall grounds. And, like Mr. Carmichael, Mr. Hollingsworth had been a professional man from London, not someone who would typically concern himself with the garden features of a country estate. Her reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door. Cherry Baker showed in Inspector Slack, whose expression suggested that this was not a social call. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination suggests that Mr. Carmichael did not die of natural causes. There are indications of asphyxiation, possibly smothering." "How very distressing," said Miss Marple, closing her journal. "I feared as much from the position of the body." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose slightly, but he continued, "We're treating this as a murder investigation. I understand you were at Gossington Hall yesterday afternoon and may have been one of the last people to see Mr. Carmichael alive, apart from the Bantries." Miss Marple described her visit to the Hall, her brief encounter with Mr. Carmichael, and the subsequent appearance of Miss Fellows. "And this Miss Fellows is still missing," Slack noted grimly. "The staff at the Blue Ball confirmed she left around 9 in the evening, saying she was going for a walk. Her belongings are still in her room, including a briefcase containing various papers related to the Tresillian estate and property boundaries." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. "And did these papers offer any explanation for Mr. Carmichael's interest in the northeast corner of the garden?" "Nothing specific," Slack replied, though there were notes about a trust established for Catherine Tresillian that included certain property and effects to be held in perpetuity. Colonel Bantry mentioned that you've been making inquiries about the Tresillian family. Miss Marple explained about her visits to Miss Weatherby and the information she had gathered about the disputed inheritance. "And you think this old family matter is connected to Carmichael's death?" Slack asked sceptically. "It does seem a rather remarkable coincidence," Miss Marple observed mildly, "especially when one considers the similar interest shown by Mr. Hollingsworth some 20 years ago." She showed the inspector her journal entries, which he read with growing interest. "And this bank manager, what became of him?" "He never returned to St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple replied. "I recall there was some mention later of his having taken a position abroad, Singapore, I believe." As Inspector Slack was leaving, he paused at the door. We'll need to find this Miss Fellows. If she's not involved in Carmichael's death, she may be in danger herself." Miss Marple agreed that locating the missing woman should be a priority. After the inspector's departure, she returned to her journals, searching for any other mentions of the Tresillian family or Gossington Hall's northeast corner. That evening, as dusk was falling, Miss Marple received another visitor. Colonel Bantry arrived, looking troubled and somewhat embarrassed. "Miss Marple, I feel I should mention something," he began, accepting the chair she offered. "It may be nothing, but in light of recent events—" "Yes, Colonel?" she encouraged gently. "The thing is, Carmichael made me an offer yesterday. Wanted to purchase the northeast section of the garden, just that small corner. Offered an absurdly generous sum. I told him I had no interest in selling any part of the property, but he was most insistent. Said his client had a sentimental attachment to that particular spot." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. "And did he name this client?" "No, maintained strict confidentiality on that point. But here's the odd thing. I happened to glance out of my study window around midnight last night and saw someone with a torch in that corner of the garden. I assumed it was one of the estate workers checking something and thought no more of it. But in light of what's happened—" "It certainly adds another piece to the puzzle," agreed Miss Marple. "I wonder—" She was interrupted by the telephone. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice tense with excitement. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened, that Miss Fellows has been seen. Jenkins spotted her at dusk prowling around the garden with some sort of tool. He thinks it was a metal detector. When he called out to her, she ran off through the woods. And Jane, Inspector Slack found something when they searched the garden more thoroughly, a small recess in the stone wall where it appears something was recently removed. There was a scrap of velvet caught on the rough edge." After the call ended, Miss Marple sat thinking deeply. The pattern was becoming clearer. Mr. Carmichael, like Mr. Hollingsworth before him, had been searching for something specific in that corner of the garden. Something valuable enough to kill for. She thought again about the riddle. "Where ancient guardians cast their shade upon the 7th hour, count 12 paces north from where the waters meet the stone. What lies beneath the constant star will guide the rightful heir." The sundial Miss Weatherby had mentioned would cast its shadow at the 7th hour, and the constant star might well refer to the North Star, often represented on sundials, or perhaps a star carved into the stone they had found. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically as she arranged these facts in her methodical mind. Tomorrow she would host a tea gathering for some of the oldest residents of St. Mary Mead. Between them, they might hold the key to understanding what treasure from the past had led to murder in the present. Chapter 6. Sunday. Tea Revelations. Sunday in St. Mary Mead always followed its comfortable, well-established pattern. The church bells rang out across the village, summoning the faithful to morning service. The vicar, Mr. Clement, delivered a sermon on charity that many in the congregation privately considered might have been inspired by recent events at Gossington Hall. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her mind only partly on the sermon. She noted with interest that Inspector Slack was present, sitting discreetly at the back of the church. More significant was the presence of an elderly gentleman she had never seen before, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and an aristocratic bearing. He sat alone, his expression attentive but unreadable. After the service, the congregation gathered in the churchyard for the customary exchange of greetings and village news. Miss Marple made her way toward Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, who were deep in conversation with Dr. Haydock. "Ah, Miss Marple," said the doctor with a nod, I was just telling the Bantries that the post-mortem results confirm our suspicions. Poor Carmichael was indeed murdered, smothered with considerable force, a strong person, our killer. Or someone in the grip of desperate determination, Miss Marple suggested mildly. You're still planning your tea gathering this afternoon? Mrs. Bantry asked. After what's happened? I think it may be more important than ever, Miss Marple replied. Old memories can sometimes cast light on present mysteries. As they spoke, Miss Marple observed the silver-haired stranger approaching. He paused politely at the edge of their small circle. Colonel Bantry, he inquired in a cultured voice. I wonder if I might introduce myself. My name is Tressilian, Edward Tressilian. I understand you are the owner of Gossington Hall. Colonel Bantry looked startled. Tressilian? Any relation to the family that owned the hall before my father's time? Indeed. My grandmother was Catherine Tressilian, the gentleman explained. I've recently arrived from Northumberland on what I had expected to be a straightforward matter of family history. It appears I've arrived at a rather dramatic moment. Miss Marple's sharp eyes didn't miss the quick glance Inspector Slack directed toward the newcomer before moving casually within earshot. You must join us for lunch at the hall, Mrs. Bantry said impulsively. And perhaps you could come to Miss Marple's tea gathering afterward. There will be several people who might remember your grandmother. Mr. Tressilian accepted with dignified gratitude, and as the churchyard emptied, Miss Marple returned home to prepare for her guests. Cherry Baker had been enlisted to help with the preparations, and the best china was laid out in the sitting-room, along with freshly baked scones and delicate sandwiches. By 3 o'clock, her small sitting-room was comfortably filled. Miss Weatherby had arrived first, followed by old Mr. Griffiths, the retired schoolmaster. Mrs. Darnley, who had once been housekeeper at Gossington Hall, came accompanied by her daughter. The Bantrys arrived with Mr. Edward Tressilian, who regarded the assembled company with polite interest. "This is most kind of you, Miss Marple," he said, as she poured the tea. "I had come to St. Mary Mead hoping to learn something of my grandmother's early life, but I never expected to find myself in the midst of a police investigation." "You knew nothing of Mr. Carmichael's interest in Gossington Hall?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Not until Colonel Bantry informed me over lunch. I must admit it raises interesting questions. My grandmother spoke very little of her early years here. There was some family unpleasantness, I gather, though she never elaborated." "The will business?" Miss Weatherby said with a nod. "Most unfortunate. Your grandmother was expected to inherit, but the estate went to Frederick Tressilian instead. There was talk at the time—" "What sort of talk, Miss Weatherby?" Miss Marple prompted when the older woman hesitated. "Well, the will was changed very suddenly, you see. Old Mr. Tressilian had always doted on Catherine. She was the apple of his eye after her parents died. Then just weeks before his death, a new will appeared, leaving everything to Frederick. Most peculiar." "And most convenient for Frederick," added Mr. Griffiths. "I recall my father speaking of it. There were suggestions of impropriety, but nothing was ever proven." Mrs. Darnley, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "It was the locket that caused the real trouble," she said in a low voice. All eyes turned to her. Miss Marple set down her teacup. "The locket? You mean like the one found in the metal box?" Mrs. Darnley nodded emphatically. "Miss Catherine had a locket, a gift from her grandfather on her 16th birthday. Inside was the key to his private strong-box where he kept important papers. After he died, the locket went missing. Frederick claimed she must have lost it, but Miss Catherine was certain it had been taken." "And what of this strong-box?" inquired Mr. Tressilian with evident interest. "Never found, as I recall," Mrs. Darnley replied, "though there was talk among the servants that Miss Catherine believed it had been hidden somewhere on the grounds. She was seen searching the garden several times before she left. Miss Marple carefully steered the conversation back to the layout of Gossington Hall in those days, particularly the northeast corner of the garden. "Yes, oh, the sundial garden," Miss Weatherby exclaimed. "It was quite the feature in its day. The sundial itself was brought back from Italy by Catherine's mother, a beautiful piece with celestial designs and a most unusual feature." "What sort of feature?" asked Colonel Bantry. "The pedestal had a hidden compartment," Miss Weatherby explained. "I remember Catherine showing it to me once when we were girls. You had to press a certain star in the design, the North Star, I believe, and a small drawer would open." There was a moment of collective silence as the significance of this revelation settled on the company. Miss Marple thought again of the riddle. What lies beneath the constant star will guide the rightful heir. "What happened to this sundial?" she asked. "It disappeared after the estate was sold," said Mr. Griffiths. "Frederick was said to have sold it, but there were rumours it had been hidden somewhere on the grounds. You know how village gossip works." "Indeed I do," Miss Marple agreed with a smile. "And the boundary markers of the original estate, do any of you recall their locations?" This prompted a detailed discussion of the old property lines, with Mr. Griffiths producing a small notebook in which he sketched a rough map. The northeastern boundary, it appeared, had once extended further than the current garden wall. "There was a small stream that marked the edge of the property," he explained. "It was diverted when the new road was built in 1902. The stone wall was erected afterward, somewhat inside the original boundary." "Where the waters meet the stone," murmured Miss Marple, recalling the words of the riddle. As the tea party drew to a close, Mr. Tressilian approached Miss Marple privately. "Might I have a word with you perhaps tomorrow? I feel there are aspects of this family matter that would benefit from your local knowledge." Miss Marple agreed to receive him the following morning. As she saw her guests out, she noticed Inspector Slack waiting discreetly across the lane. He would no doubt be interested in what had been discussed at the tea gathering. That evening, as darkness fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window watching the lights of the village. The pieces of the puzzle were gradually coming together. The sundial with its hidden compartment, the missing strong box, the locket that was both a gift and a key. Someone had killed Mr. Carmichael to keep him from discovering whatever secret lay buried at Gossington Hall, and if her suspicions were correct, that same someone might now be turning their attention to Mr. Edward Tressilian, the unexpected arrival who claimed to be Catherine's grandson and possibly the rightful heir mentioned in the riddle. Miss Marple reached for her telephone. It was time to share her concerns with Inspector Slack. Chapter 7. The Locket's Secret. Monday morning dawned with a thin mist hovering over St. Mary Mead, lending the village an ethereal quality that would burn away once the sun rose higher. Miss Marple was at her breakfast, the Morning Post beside her plate, when Cherry Baker announced that Colonel Bantry had arrived and was most anxious to speak with her. "My dear Miss Marple," he said as he entered, declining her offer of tea, "I've brought the locket from the box. After yesterday's revelations, I thought you should examine it more carefully." "How very thoughtful," Miss Marple replied, accepting the small silver oval. "Mrs. Bantry is well this morning?" "Considerably shaken, I'm afraid. There was another intrusion in the garden last night. Footprints again, and signs that someone had been digging near the stone wall. I've set Jenkins to keep watch, though that's hardly likely to deter someone desperate enough to commit murder." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically and turned her attention to the locket. In the clear morning light, she examined it with great care, her fingers tracing the delicate engraving on its surface. The portrait inside was just as they had seen before, a young woman with a serious expression, dressed in the fashion of the late Victorian era. "Catherine Tressilian," she murmured. "She looks rather like her grandson, doesn't she?" "Something about the eyes." "If he is her grandson," Colonel Bantry said with a touch of scepticism. "Inspector Slack has been making inquiries. Apparently this Edward Tressilian only recently began claiming his connection to the family. Before that, he was simply Edward Clark, a retired professor of history from Durham University." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. Her fingers continued to explore the locket, pressing gently at various points of the design. "You know, Colonel, these old lockets often had hidden compartments. Family jewellery frequently served practical purposes beyond mere adornment." As she spoke, there was a faint click, and a small section of the back of the locket slid aside, revealing a tiny recess. Within lay a small key, hardly larger than a watch key, and folded into an impossibly small square, a scrap of yellowed paper. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Colonel Bantry, leaning forward. "You found something." With meticulous care, Miss Marple extracted the key and, using her embroidery needle, carefully unfolded the paper. The writing on it was faded but still legible, in a fine flowing hand. "North wall of St. Mary's, third stone from the eastern corner, beneath the carved lily." "C.B. C.B.?" Colonel Bantry looked puzzled. "Catherine's mother was a Beddoes before her marriage," Miss Marple explained. "Clara Beddoes, if I recall correctly. Miss Weatherby mentioned it yesterday." "And St. Mary's, that would be the church?" "Most likely," Miss Marple agreed. "The north wall has several decorative carvings, including floral motifs. I believe there is indeed a lily near the eastern corner." Colonel Bantry stood up decisively. "We should inform Inspector Slack immediately." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "But I wonder if we might first verify whether there is indeed something hidden at the location described. It may be nothing more than a family keepsake." After some discussion, they agreed that a discreet examination of the church wall would be prudent before involving the police further. As they were about to leave, the telephone rang. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice tense with excitement. "Jane!" "Is Arthur with you? The most extraordinary thing has happened. Inspector Slack has been here all morning. They've found Miss Fellows." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Where was she found?" "At the Blue Boar of all places. She returned early this morning, claiming she had gone to London to consult some records." "Inspector Slack is questioning her now. And Jane, he's discovered something quite shocking. She isn't Mr. Carmichael's assistant at all. She's Frederick Tressilian's granddaughter." This was a revelation indeed. After assuring Mrs. Bantry that the Colonel would return shortly, Miss Marple replaced the receiver and relayed this startling information. "Frederick's granddaughter?" Colonel Bantry looked astonished. "Then she and this Edward Tressilian are cousins in a manner of speaking, both descendants of the original Tressilian brothers." "If Mr. Edward is indeed Catherine's grandson," Miss Marple reminded him, "that remains to be established." They proceeded to St. Mary's Church, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, was busy arranging flowers for a wedding scheduled for the following day. He greeted them warmly, and when told of their interest in the carvings on the north wall, was happy to provide information about the church's architectural features. "The north wall dates from the 15th century, he explained, leading them outside. "The carvings were added during renovations in 1870. See, here we have various symbols, the lamb, the dove, and these floral designs including the lily, which represented purity." The lily carving was exactly where the note had indicated, on the third stone from the eastern corner of the north wall. The stone itself appeared no different from those surrounding it, but when Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly over the surface, she detected a slight depression around the carved flower. "I believe this stone may be loose," she said quietly to Colonel Bantry. Using a small gardening trowel the Colonel had thoughtfully brought along, they carefully probed the edges of the stone. To their surprise, it moved slightly, revealing that it was indeed not mortared in place like the others, but had been designed to be removed. "A hiding place," murmured Colonel Bantry. "Ingenious!" Together they managed to slide the stone partly outward, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a flat metal container roughly the size of a small book, tarnished with age but intact. The tiny key from the locket fit perfectly into its lock. Inside the box they found several folded documents, the paper yellowed with age but preserved by the dryness of their hiding place. Colonel Bantry examined them with growing excitement. "These appear to be legal papers," he said. "And look, this one bears the signature of Percival Tressilian, dated 1892. It seems to be a will or trust document of some kind." "Perhaps we should take these to Inspector Slack now," suggested Miss Marple. "They may provide the motive for Mr. Carmichael's murder." They carefully replaced the stone and returned to Miss Marple's cottage, where they telephoned Inspector Slack. He arrived promptly, accompanied by a constable, and examined the documents with professional interest. "This changes matters considerably," he said after reading through them. "It appears the old gentleman, Percival Tressilian, did indeed make provision for his granddaughter Catherine. A trust was established separate from the main estate, placing certain assets, including family jewels of considerable value, in safekeeping for her and her descendants." "And the sundial?" inquired Miss Marple. "Is there any mention of it?" Inspector Slack nodded. According to this inventory, it contained a hidden compartment in which certain items were secreted, including, it seems, directions to this very hiding place in the church wall. The riddle in the metal box was clearly meant to lead Catherine or her heirs to the sundial, which would in turn lead them to these documents. "Which would explain why someone was so determined to find it," Colonel Bantry observed, "and why Mr. Carmichael was killed." As Inspector Slack departed with the documents, promising to keep them informed of developments, Miss Marple remembered that Mr. Edward Tressilian had arranged to call on her that morning. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11, and he had not yet arrived. "I wonder," she said to Colonel Bantry, "if Mr. Tressilian has been delayed, or perhaps after yesterday's revelations he has had second thoughts about our meeting." "Or," suggested the Colonel grimly, "someone has ensured that he doesn't share whatever information he possesses." Miss Marple looked troubled. The pattern was becoming clearer, but with clarity came danger. If her suspicions were correct, there was still one more piece of the puzzle to be found, and one more life that might be at risk. Chapter 8. The Solution Unearthed. By late afternoon, Miss Marple's cottage had become the unlikely centre of the investigation. Inspector Slack had established himself in her sitting room, his notes spread across her small writing desk. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry were seated on the sofa, while Dr. Haydock stood by the fireplace. The unexpected arrival of Mr. Edward Tressilian, looking somewhat dishevelled, but very much alive, had been a relief to all concerned. "You had us quite worried, Mr. Tressilian," Miss Marple said as she poured tea for the assembled company, "when you failed to keep our appointment this morning." "I must apologize for that," he replied with evident embarrassment. "I received an urgent message asking me to meet someone at the old stone bridge, supposedly with information about my grandmother. When I arrived, there was no one there, but as I waited, I noticed someone watching from the woods. I'm afraid I became rather suspicious and decided to make a rather circuitous journey back to the village." "Yes, sir. His credentials check out completely. He is indeed Edward Clark Tressilian, grandson of Catherine Tressilian, through her daughter Mary, who married James Clark." "And Miss Fellows?" inquired Miss Marple. Has she made any statement? She continues to maintain that she knew nothing of Mr. Carmichael's death, Inspector Slack replied. Claims she went to London to consult some property records, though she admits she is indeed Frederick Tressilian's granddaughter, Margaret Tressilian. She changed her name professionally some years ago. The doorbell rang, and Cherry Baker showed in 2 more visitors, Miss Fellows herself, escorted by another police officer, and the vicar, who had been summoned by Inspector Slack. Now that we're all assembled, the inspector began, I think it's time to resolve this matter, Miss Marple. Since you were the one who first recognized the pattern in these events, perhaps you would share your thoughts. Miss Marple looked momentarily flustered by this invitation, but she recovered her composure quickly. It's really very simple, she began in her gentle voice, once one understands the human nature involved. You see, this case reminds me rather of young Tommy Simpkins, who once buried his grandmother's thimble in the garden and then created an elaborate treasure map to find it again, only to discover that his cousin had observed him and got there first. There was a momentary silence as the company tried to follow this comparison. What I mean to say, Miss Marple continued, is that the essential pattern became clear once we understood what was being sought. The metal box containing the riddle was deliberately buried where it would eventually be found, particularly if that area was ever disturbed, as it was for the rose garden. It was, in effect, a message in a bottle, set adrift on the sea of time by someone who hoped it would eventually reach the right person. Catherine Tressilian, Edward Tressilian said quietly. Precisely, nodded Miss Marple. She knew she could not defeat her cousin Frederick in the courts. She lacked both resources and evidence. But she believed in justice eventually prevailing. The riddle was her insurance policy for the future. But who buried the box? Mrs. Bantry asked. Catherine herself? I think not, said Miss Marple. The riddle refers to the sundial, which had already been removed or hidden by the time Catherine left Gossington Hall. No, I believe it was someone who remained behind, someone loyal to Catherine who knew the whole story. Old Jenkins? Colonel Bantry exclaimed suddenly. The gardener! His grandson mentioned that he had worked at Gossington Hall for both families. And would have known the grounds intimately, Miss Marple agreed, including where the sundial had stood and the significance of the 7th-hour shadow. He could have composed and buried the riddle box years later, hoping that someday the rightful Tressilian heir would return. Which brings us to the present day, Inspector Slack interjected. Mr. Carmichael, a solicitor, begins making inquiries about the property on behalf of a client, presumably you, Miss Fellows. All eyes turned to the young woman, who remained composed under their scrutiny. My grandfather, Frederick Tressilian, left certain papers suggesting there might be valuable items still hidden at Gossington Hall. He had searched for them himself without success. Before he died, he asked me to continue the search. So you engaged Mr. Carmichael, Miss Marple said. Yes, he specialized in historical property matters. We had no idea about the trust documents or the riddle until the box was found. And when it was, Inspector Slack continued, you realized someone else might solve the puzzle first and claim whatever had been hidden. I was simply trying to protect my family's interests, Miss Fellows said defensively. By murdering Mr. Carmichael? Dr. Haydock asked quietly. A tense silence fell over the room. Miss Fellows' face drained of colour. I did no such thing. I was in London when he died. Were you indeed? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. I think not, my dear. You see, when I examined the garden yesterday morning, I noticed something quite distinctive about the footprints near where Mr. Carmichael's body was found. The person who made them had a particular habit of gardening. They knelt on one knee rather than bending from the waist. I fail to see, Miss Fellows began. It's a rather unusual habit. Miss Marple continued, but one I've observed before. The postmistress's nephew, Derek, has the same tendency, the result, he told me, of an old riding injury that makes bending difficult. I couldn't help but notice yesterday, when you were examining the flower border at the Blue Boar while waiting for Inspector Slack, that you have the same habit. You kneel on your right knee, supporting yourself with your left hand. That hardly proves I killed anyone, Miss Fellows protested, but her voice had lost its confidence. No, but it places you at the scene, said Inspector Slack, and we've found soil matching the Gossington Hall garden on shoes in your room, shoes you apparently forgot to take with you on your supposed trip to London. The pattern becomes quite clear, Miss Marple said sadly. When Mr. Carmichael discovered the significance of the riddle and the probable location of the sundial's hidden compartment, you realized he would uncover the trust documents that might establish Mr. Tressilian here as the rightful heir to the assets your grandfather had appropriated. You followed Mr. Carmichael to the garden early that morning and— "He wouldn't listen to reason," Miss Fellows burst out suddenly. "I only wanted to talk to him, to explain that my grandfather had built a life on what he'd taken, that revealing the truth now would only hurt innocent people, but he was so self-righteous, so determined to expose everything. I just wanted him to stop talking. I never meant to—" Her voice trailed off as the implications of her confession settled over the room. Inspector Slack nodded to the officer who stepped forward and formally arrested Miss Fellows for the murder of Mr. Carmichael. As she was led away, Edward Tressilian looked troubled. "I had no idea my arrival would precipitate such tragedy. My interest was purely historical, to understand my grandmother's early life. The possibility of an inheritance never crossed my mind." "Human nature is remarkably consistent," Miss Marple observed as she refilled teacups. "Fear of exposure, of losing what one believes is rightfully theirs. These motives have driven people to desperate acts throughout history. Miss Fellows believed she was protecting her family legacy." "What will happen now?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "With the trust and the jewels, I mean?" "That will be for the courts to decide," the vicar said, "though I imagine there is a clear legal heir now that the original documents have been found." Later, after the others had departed, Miss Marple and Colonel Bantry walked in the garden, enjoying the evening calm after the day's dramatic events. "I suppose we should get back to planning that rose garden," the Colonel said with a wry smile. "After all, that's what started this whole business." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though perhaps you might consider including a sundial in your design, Colonel, as a reminder that time reveals all secrets in the end." She gazed thoughtfully at the sunset, painting the village in golden light. The Tressilian case had followed a pattern she had observed many times in her long life, that buried truths like bulbs planted in autumn will eventually find their way to the surface when conditions are right. The riddle had finally yielded its answer, justice had been served, and soon Gossington Hall's rose garden would bloom where old secrets had once lain hidden, bringing beauty from the soil of the past. I hope you enjoyed our journey through the Rose Garden Riddle. If you did, please consider subscribing to Cafe Stories. Your support helps keep these tales of mystery and intrigue coming. Until next time, pay attention to the small details in life. Remember that human nature remains remarkably consistent, and never underestimate a keen-eyed elderly lady with her knitting. This is Alfie, signing off from Cafe Stories.